I'm not dead. I'm not living a secret life somewhere. For 3 years, I've been a prisoner in plain sight, and my captor has been having Sunday dinners with my husband, playing the role of the supportive brother, while keeping me locked away just miles from our home. Before we begin, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more stories like this one. My name is Emma Richardson, and this is the story of how I disappeared on my wedding day and lived to tell about it. 3 years ago today, I was supposed to marry Michael Thompson, the man I thought was my soulmate. We'd been together for 4 years, and everything about our relationship felt perfect. Michael was kind, gentle, successful, everything I'd ever wanted in a husband. He worked as an architect for a prestigious firm in downtown Seattle, and I was an elementary school teacher who absolutely loved working with kids. Our wedding was planned for October 15th, 2021, at the beautiful Fairmont Olympic Hotel. We'd invited 150 guests, and I'd spent months planning every detail. My dress was a stunning vintage-inspired gown that had belonged to my grandmother. My bridesmaids wore dusty rose, and the flowers were white peonies and eucalyptus. Everything was exactly how I'd dreamed it would be. But there was one thing about Michael that should have worried me more than it did. His relationship with his older brother, David. David Thompson was different from Michael in every way possible. Where Michael was calm and thoughtful, David was intense and unpredictable. Where Michael built things up through his architecture, work, David seemed to tear things down through his various failed business ventures and troubled relationships. Michael was successful and stable. David was constantly struggling with money, jobs, and personal problems. The brothers had a complicated history. David was 5 years older than Michael, and according to family stories, he'd always been jealous of his younger brother's success. Michael had graduated valedictorian from high school while David barely passed. Michael had gotten a full scholarship to college, while David had dropped out after 1 semester. Michael had a successful career, while David bounced from job to job, never able to hold anything down for long. But Michael, being the kind person he was, never gave up on his brother. He constantly tried to help David get back on his feet. He'd lent him money, helped him find jobs, even let David live with him for months at a time when David was between apartments. Michael's parents, Robert and Patricia Thompson, had long since grown tired of David's problems and had essentially cut him off. But Michael always believed that David could change, that he just needed the right opportunity. I'll admit, David made me uncomfortable from the very beginning of my relationship with Michael. There was something about the way he looked at me that felt wrong. It wasn't just attraction, though that was certainly part of it. It was something deeper and more possessive, like he thought I belonged to him instead of Michael. David would show up at our apartment unannounced, always with some crisis that required Michael's immediate attention. He'd interrupt our date nights, our quiet evenings at home, even our vacations. And whenever Michael tried to set boundaries, David would manipulate him with guilt, reminding him of all the times he'd been there for Michael when they were kids, or how their parents had abandoned him. The worst part was how David acted when Michael wasn't around. He'd make inappropriate comments about my appearance, stand too close to me, find excuses to touch my arm or shoulder. Once, when Michael was out of town for work, David showed up at my apartment at 11 o'clock at night, claiming he'd lost his keys and needed a place to stay. I let him sleep on the couch because I didn't know what else to do. But I barely slept that night, keeping my bedroom door locked and my phone close by. When I told Michael about these incidents, he always had an explanation. David was just lonely. David didn't understand social boundaries because he'd never had a serious relationship. David was going through a rough time and didn't mean anything by his behavior. Michael would talk to David, and David would apologize profusely and promise to be more respectful. But the behavior always resumed after a few weeks. As our wedding date approached, David's behavior became even more erratic. He'd call Michael at all hours with various emergencies. He'd show up at my school, claiming he wanted to surprise me with lunch. But then he'd linger in my classroom making small talk until I had to ask him to leave because my students were coming back from recess. He started bringing me gifts, flowers, jewelry, books, always with some innocent explanation. But the frequency and intimacy of the gifts made me increasingly uncomfortable. 2 weeks before the wedding, I finally told Michael that I thought David's behavior was crossing serious lines and that I was genuinely scared of him. I begged Michael to consider not having David as his best man, or at least to have a serious conversation with him about appropriate boundaries. Michael was torn. He could see that David's behavior was making me uncomfortable. But David was his only brother, and their parents had already essentially disowned David. Michael felt like if he abandoned David too, it would destroy David completely. We had several difficult conversations about it, and ultimately Michael promised me that he would have a serious talk with David about his behavior and that things would change after the wedding. Looking back now, I realize that conversation was probably what sealed my fate. The morning of October 15th, 2021, dawned crisp and clear. It was one of those perfect Seattle fall days where the leaves are just starting to turn, and there's a hint of winter in the air, but the sun is still warm. I woke up in my apartment feeling nervous but excited. In 12 hours, I would be Mrs. Emma Thompson. My bridesmaids, my sister Sarah, my best friend from college Jessica, and 2 friends from work, Amanda and Lisa, arrived at my apartment at 8 in the morning. We had mimosas and bagels for breakfast, then headed to the salon for hair and makeup. Everything felt magical. My hair was styled in an elegant updo with small pearl pins that had belonged to my grandmother. My makeup was natural but glowing, exactly what I'd envisioned. We arrived at the hotel at 2 o'clock to get dressed and take photos before the 4 o'clock ceremony. The bridal suite was gorgeous, with huge windows overlooking Elliott Bay. My dress fit perfectly, and when I looked at myself in the mirror, I felt like a princess. My bridesmaids looked beautiful in their dusty rose gowns, and we took dozens of photos together, laughing and crying happy tears. At 3:30, the photographer wanted to get some shots of me alone before the ceremony. My bridesmaids went downstairs to check on the final details and make sure the groomsmen were ready. I was alone in the bridal suite, putting on my grandmother's pearl earrings and taking a few quiet moments to myself before the biggest day of my life began. That's when there was a knock on the door. Assumed it was one of my bridesmaids coming back to get something they'd forgotten, or maybe the wedding coordinator with a last-minute question. I called out, "Come in," without even thinking about it. But it wasn't my bridesmaids or the coordinator. It was David. He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him, and immediately I knew something was wrong. He was dressed in his black tuxedo, ready for the ceremony, but his expression was strange, intense, almost wild. "David," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "You shouldn't be here. It's bad luck for the groomsmen to see the bride before the ceremony." He didn't respond to that. Instead, he just stood there staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. His eyes were moving up and down my body in a way that made my skin crawl. "You look beautiful, Emma," he said finally, his voice soft and strange. "You look perfect." "Thank you," I said, backing toward the window. "But you really need to leave. The ceremony starts in 30 minutes, and I need to finish getting ready." "Do you?" he asked, tilting his head. "Do you really need to finish getting ready for a wedding that's never going to happen?" My blood ran cold. "What are you talking about, David?" He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small glass vial filled with clear liquid. "I'm talking about the fact that you're not marrying my brother today. You're not marrying anyone today." I realized I was in serious danger. I started moving toward the door, but David stepped sideways to block my path. "David, whatever you're thinking, please don't do this," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Michael loves you. He's been trying to help you. This isn't the way to..." "Help me?" David laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Michael doesn't want to help me. Michael wants to control me. He wants to be the successful one, the good one, the one who gets everything while I get nothing." "Well, not this time." "What are you talking about? Michael has always been there for you. Michael gets the career, the money, the respect, the perfect life. And now he gets you too. The beautiful, sweet, perfect woman who thinks he's some kind of hero." David's voice was getting louder, more agitated. "But he doesn't deserve you, Emma. He doesn't understand you the way I do." I realized that David had been obsessed with me for much longer than I'd understood. This wasn't just inappropriate behavior or poor boundaries. This was something much darker. "David, please," I said, trying a different approach. "If you care about me, you won't hurt me. You'll let me go downstairs and marry your brother, and we can all move forward together as a family." As shook his head. "You think I want to watch you be happy with Michael for the rest of my life? You think I want to come to your anniversary parties and watch him kiss you and hold your hand and live the life that should have been mine? It was never going to be yours, David, I said, knowing it was dangerous, but unable to stop myself. I love Michael. I've never loved you. I've never even liked you. That was the wrong thing to say. David's face went dark with rage. You'll learn to love me, he said quietly. You'll have plenty of time to learn. He uncapped the vial and started moving toward me. I screamed as loud as I could and tried to run for the door, but David was faster and stronger than me. He grabbed my arm and spun me around, and before I could scream again, he'd pressed a cloth soaked with the liquid over my mouth and nose. The smell was chemical and sharp, and within seconds I felt dizzy and disoriented. I tried to fight, but my limbs felt heavy and uncoordinated. The last thing I remember before losing consciousness was David's voice in my ear, saying, "Don't worry, Emma. Where we're going, no one will ever find you." When I woke up, I was in complete darkness. My head was pounding, my mouth was dry, and I felt nauseous from whatever David had used to drug me. I tried to move, but my hands were zip-tied behind my back, and my ankles were bound together. I was lying on what felt like a concrete floor, and when I tried to call out, my voice came out as barely a whisper. Gradually, my eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I realized I was in some kind of basement or underground room. There were no windows, just concrete walls and a single metal door with what looked like a slot near the bottom. The air smelled musty and damp, like a space that hadn't been used in a long time. I have no idea how long I lay there in the dark, trying to process what had happened to me. My wedding. My beautiful wedding I'd spent months planning. My guests were probably arriving at the hotel right now, wondering where I was. Michael was probably getting dressed in his tuxedo, expecting to see me walk down the aisle in a few hours. And instead, I was tied up in a basement, kidnapped by his own brother. Eventually, I heard footsteps above me, and then the sound of locks being turned. The metal door opened, and David appeared, now wearing jeans and a t-shirt instead of his tuxedo. He was carrying a plate of food and a bottle of water. "You're awake," he said, as if this was a perfectly normal situation. "Good. You must be hungry." "David," I said, my voice still hoarse. "Please let me go. Michael must be worried sick. Everyone at the wedding thinks you got cold feet and ran away." David interrupted. "I left your car at SeaTac Airport with a note saying you realized you couldn't go through with the marriage and needed time to think. By now they've probably all gone home." My heart sank. Of course David had thought of everything. He'd probably been planning this for months. "They'll look for me," I said. "Michael will never believe that I just ran away." "Maybe not at first," David agreed. "But what's he going to do?" "You left a note. Your car was found. There's no evidence of foul play. Eventually he'll have to accept that you chose to leave." David untied my hands so I could eat, but kept my ankles bound. The food was a peanut butter sandwich and some crackers. Simple, like he'd grabbed whatever was in the kitchen. I was too scared and sick to have much appetite, but I forced myself to eat a little, knowing I needed to keep my strength up. "Where are we?" I asked. "Somewhere safe," David said. "Somewhere no one will think to look." "David, please. I know you think you love me, but this isn't love. Love doesn't involve kidnapping someone on their wedding day." David's expression hardened. "Don't tell me what love is, Emma. I've loved you since the moment Michael introduced us. I've watched you for 4 years, learning everything about you, understanding you in a way that Michael never could. Michael loves the idea of you, the pretty teacher, the perfect wife. But I love the real you. You don't know the real me at all," I said. "The real me is terrified of you. The real me wants nothing more than to get away from you and never see you again. That's because you've been brainwashed by Michael," David said calmly. "You think you love him because he's safe and successful and everything a woman is supposed to want. But deep down, you know there's something missing. You know you need someone who understands your darkness." "I don't have any darkness," I said. "I'm a kindergarten teacher. I like reading and hiking and cooking dinner with my fiancé. I'm not complicated or mysterious. I'm exactly who I appear to be. Everyone has darkness, Emma, and I'm going to help you find yours." That first day set the pattern for what would become my life for the next 3 years. David kept me in that basement room, bringing me meals twice a day and allowing me out for brief periods to use a small bathroom down the hall. The room had a single cot with thin blankets, a small table, and nothing else. No books, no television, no contact with the outside world. David had clearly put a lot of thought into this prison. The room was soundproof. I could scream as loud as I wanted, and no one would hear me. There were multiple locks on the door, and even if I somehow managed to get out of the room, I would still be in what appeared to be a large basement with no obvious exit. But the physical prison was only part of my torment. The psychological torture was much worse. David truly believed that he was saving me from a life I didn't really want. In his twisted mind, he was doing me a favor by preventing me from making the mistake of marrying Michael. He would sit in my room for hours, talking about how much better suited we were for each other, how he understood me in ways that Michael never could, how grateful I would be once I realized what he'd done for me. He brought me a television after the first week, but it only received local news channels. I was forced to watch reports about my own disappearance, seeing Michael's anguished face as he pleaded for information about what had happened to me. The police had indeed found my car at the airport with a note in my handwriting. David had somehow managed to forge my writing, saying that I couldn't go through with the wedding and needed time away to think. The most heartbreaking part was watching interviews with my family and friends. My parents were devastated, refusing to believe that I would just disappear without a word. My sister Sarah was angry, insisting that something terrible had happened to me and that the police weren't taking the case seriously enough. My bridesmaids were confused and hurt, wondering how they could have missed signs that I was having doubts about the marriage. But it was watching Michael that nearly broke me. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in the span of a week. He kept insisting to reporters that something had happened to me, that I would never have left voluntarily, that someone must have taken me. But as the days passed, and no evidence of abduction was found, even Michael began to look uncertain, and through it all, David was right there beside him, playing the role of the supportive brother, comforting Michael in his grief, helping with the search efforts, even organizing a reward fund for information about my whereabouts. It was sickening to watch David console my fiancé while keeping me locked in a basement just miles away. After about a month, David started bringing me newspaper clippings and printouts from social media about my disappearance. The stories gradually shifted from missing woman to runaway bride. People began speculating about what could have caused me to abandon my wedding at the last minute. Some suggested that I'd been having an affair. Others theorized that I'd discovered something terrible about Michael. A few cruel commenters even suggested that I'd been using Michael for his money and had found someone wealthier. You see, David would say as he showed me these articles, everyone's moving on with their lives. Michael is starting to accept that you chose to leave. Your family is beginning to grieve you like you're dead. No one is really looking for you anymore. But that wasn't entirely true. Michael never stopped looking for me. Even as the official police investigation wound down, he hired private detectives. He traveled to other cities following false leads. He kept my case alive on social media, posting about me regularly and begging for any information that might help find me. And David was right there helping him with all of it. The cruelest part of David's plan was how he used Michael's grief to grow closer to him. Michael had lost his fiancée and was dealing with the pain of believing that I'd abandoned him. David positioned himself as the only person who truly understood Michael's pain, the only family member who hadn't given up hope, the only one who still believed that I loved Michael and hadn't left voluntarily. From watching the news coverage, I could see that David had essentially moved in with Michael after my disappearance. He was helping Michael deal with the practical aspects of canceling the wedding, returning gifts, and handling all the questions from friends and family. He was the one driving Michael to therapy appointments and making sure he was eating and sleeping. He was playing the part of the devoted brother perfectly. Meanwhile, he was visiting me in that basement every single day, talking about how much he loved me and how we were going to build a life together. After about 6 months, David's visits became longer and more frequent. He would bring books for me to read, always romance novels where the heroine ended up with the dark, dangerous man instead of the safe, boring one. He would bring me art supplies and encourage me to draw or paint, claiming that creative expression would help me understand my true feelings. He brought me journals and asked me to write about my thoughts and emotions. Most disturbingly, he started bringing me updates about Michael's life, as if we were friends gossiping about a mutual acquaintance, instead of captor and prisoner discussing the man I loved. Michael's been dating someone, David told me casually one day. about 8 months after my disappearance. Her name is Jennifer. She's a nurse at Swedish Medical Center. They met when Michael went to the emergency room after he fell off a ladder while trying to clean out your old apartment. The news hit me like a physical blow. Of course Michael was dating someone. It had been 8 months since I'd disappeared. He thought I'd abandoned him. He had every right to move on with his life. But hearing about it from David, in that horrible basement where I was being held prisoner, was almost unbearable. "You're lying," I said, though I could see in David's expression that he wasn't. "I'm not lying, Emma. I would never lie to you. Michael brought Jennifer to Sunday dinner at my parents' house last week. Mom really likes her. She said Jennifer is good for Michael, that she's helping him heal from the trauma of losing you." David watched my face carefully as he delivered this information, clearly enjoying my pain. "Don't look so sad," he said. "This is good news. This proves that Michael never really loved you the way I do. If he truly loved you, he wouldn't be able to move on so easily. But look how quickly he replaced you. 8 months isn't quickly," I said weakly. "And he didn't replace me. He thinks I left him. If I thought you had left me, I would spend the rest of my life trying to find you and win you back," David said. "I would never give up and start dating someone else. That's the difference between Michael's love and mine." David would bring me updates about Michael's new relationship, each one designed to make me feel more abandoned and forgotten. Michael and Jennifer were spending more time together. They'd taken a weekend trip to Portland. Jennifer had met Michael's co-workers. They'd been together for 6 months, a year, 18 months. And through it all, David was right there, playing the supportive brother role. He was the best man at their wedding when they got married 2 years after my disappearance. He gave a touching speech about how happy he was that Michael had found love again, how he knew that I would have wanted Michael to be happy, how Jennifer was exactly the kind of woman Michael deserved. I watched that wedding on the news, sitting in my basement prison, while David sat beside me providing commentary. "She's pretty," David said, watching Jennifer walk down the aisle in a simple white dress. "Not as beautiful as you, but pretty enough. And she seems sweet. Michael likes sweet women." "Stop," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "The interesting thing is how much happier Michael looks with her than he ever did with you," David continued. "Look at his face, Emma. When was the last time you saw him smile like that? Even at your own engagement party, he never looked that relaxed and joyful." "Stop," I said again, louder this time. "I think Jennifer is better suited for Michael than you ever were," David said thoughtfully. "You were always too independent, too strong-willed. Michael needs someone who will let him take care of her, someone who will appreciate his stability and kindness without constantly pushing against his boundaries. Jennifer understands that. You never did." I realized that David was right, and that realization was almost worse than everything else he'd put me through. Michael did look happier with Jennifer than he'd often looked with me. Not because I'd been a bad fiancé, or because our relationship had been wrong, but because he was free of the constant stress and conflict that David had created in our lives. Jennifer didn't have to deal with David's inappropriate behavior and manipulation. Michael could just be himself with her, without constantly having to mediate between his fiancé and his troubled brother. In a twisted way, my disappearance had solved Michael's biggest problem. He'd been caught between loyalty to his brother and protecting me from David's behavior. With me gone, that conflict had disappeared. David could play the role of the supportive, grieving brother-in-law, and Michael could find happiness with someone who didn't trigger David's obsessive jealousy. As I watched Michael and Jennifer dance at their wedding reception, with David standing in the background applauding, I understood that David had won. He'd successfully destroyed my life and stolen any chance I'd had at happiness with Michael. Even if I somehow escaped, Michael had moved on. He had a new wife, and probably soon they would have children and a whole life together that didn't include me. But David wasn't done with me yet. "Now that Michael has found his happiness," David said as we watched the wedding coverage, "it's time for us to find ours." "What do you mean?" I asked, though I was afraid I already knew. "I mean, it's time for you to stop grieving a relationship that was never right for you, and start building the relationship that you were always meant to have, with me." For the next year, David intensified his efforts to make me fall in love with him. He redecorated my prison room, bringing in nicer furniture, better bedding, and personal touches that he thought I would appreciate. He brought me better food, often cooking elaborate meals that we would eat together in my room, while he talked about his plans for our future. He started allowing me out of the basement for short periods, always under careful supervision. The basement was part of a large house in what appeared to be a rural area. I could see trees and farmland through the windows, but no neighboring houses or signs of civilization. The house itself was old and isolated, clearly chosen specifically for its suitability as a prison. David would take me outside to a small, fenced backyard where I could get fresh air and sunlight. These moments of freedom were both wonderful and torturous. Wonderful because I desperately needed to be outside after months in that basement, but torturous because they reminded me of everything I'd lost. "I bought this house for us," David told me during one of these outdoor sessions. "I've been planning this for over a year, saving up money, making sure everything was perfect for when we could finally be together." "This isn't being together, David," I said. "This is imprisonment. This is abuse." "It's only imprisonment because you're fighting it," David replied. "Once you accept that this is where you belong, once you stop trying to resist what's happening between us, you'll see that this is actually freedom. Freedom freedom trying to be someone you're not. Freedom to explore the connection that you've been denying for years." David genuinely believed that I would eventually fall in love with him, he thought. That if he just kept me isolated long enough, if he showed me enough kindness and attention, if he demonstrated his devotion clearly enough, I would see that he was the right man for me all along. He brought me books about Stockholm Syndrome and trauma bonding, not because he was aware that's what he was trying to create, but because he thought they were love stories. He saw the relationships in those books as examples of how powerful love could develop under intense circumstances, not as examples of psychological manipulation and abuse. The most disturbing part was that David wasn't entirely wrong about some things. After 3 years of isolation, I had developed a strange dependence on him. He was my only human contact, my only source of food and basic necessities, my only connection to the outside world. On the rare occasions when he left for more than a day, I found myself actually missing his presence, not because I loved him, but because the complete isolation was even worse than his company. I also began to understand him in ways I'd never wanted to. Through his daily monologues about his feelings and his past, I learned about his childhood, his failures, his disappointments, and the gradual development of his obsession with me. I could see the lonely, damaged person underneath, the criminal behavior, which made it harder to maintain the pure hatred that had sustained me in the early months. But understanding someone and caring about them isn't the same as loving them, no matter what David believed, and I never stopped planning my escape. The problem was that David had thought of everything. The house was in a remote location with no neighbors for miles. All the windows had bars, and all the doors had multiple locks. The basement where I spent most of my time was essentially a bunker, designed to contain someone exactly like me. David had clearly researched abduction and imprisonment extensively, because every security measure I could think of had already been implemented. But David's greatest strength was also his greatest weakness, his need to maintain his relationship with Michael and his role as the supportive brother. Every Sunday, David would drive into town for dinner with Michael and Jennifer. He would spend holidays with them, attend their anniversary celebrations, and be present for all the major milestones in their marriage. Maintaining this relationship was crucial to David's plan, because it kept him above suspicion and allowed him to monitor Michael's emotional state. These regular absences were my only opportunities to work on escape plans. David always locked me in the basement when he left, but over time I managed to find weaknesses in his security. I discovered that one of the basement windows, while barred, had old mortar that I could slowly chip away at using a small piece of metal I'd found. I also found that I could partially pick the lock on my room door, using bobby pins that David had brought me for my hair. But even if I could get out of the basement, I still faced the problem of being miles from civilization with no transportation and no clear idea of where I was. I needed to time my escape carefully, and I needed to have a plan for getting help once I was free. The breakthrough came during David's third Christmas with Michael and Jennifer. David had been gone for most of the day, attending Christmas dinner at Michael's house. I used the time to work on the basement window, and finally managed to loosen one of the bars enough that I could squeeze through. It was December 25th, 2023, exactly 3 years and 2 months after my wedding day. I was 31 years old, and I'd spent more than 3 years of my life in that basement. But finally, I was free. The escape itself was terrifying and exhausting. I climbed through the basement window into a snowy backyard, wearing only the thin clothes that David had given me and a pair of old sneakers. I had no coat, no money, and no clear idea of where I was going. But I knew I had to get as far away from that house as possible before David returned. I walked through woods and farmland for what felt like hours, following what appeared to be an old dirt road. My feet were numb with cold, and I was shivering uncontrollably by the time I finally saw lights in the distance. It was a small farmhouse, and when I knocked on the door, an elderly woman answered. I must have looked like something out of a nightmare, thin, pale, shaking with cold, and wearing clothes that clearly didn't fit properly. But the woman, whose name was Margaret Foster, took one look at me and immediately brought me inside. "Dear God, what happened to you?" she asked, wrapping a blanket around my shoulders and guiding me to a chair by the fireplace. "I need to call the police," I said through chattering teeth. "My name is Emma Richardson, and I've been held prisoner for 3 years. Margaret stared at me for a moment, and then her eyes widened with recognition. "Emma Richardson," she repeated slowly. "The girl who disappeared on her wedding day?" "Yes," I said, tears streaming down my face. "That's me." Margaret Foster lived alone on her farm about 15 miles outside of Spokane, Washington. I'd been held prisoner less than 3 hours from Seattle, close enough that David could easily maintain his relationship with Michael while keeping me completely isolated. Margaret immediately called 911, and within an hour, her small farmhouse was filled with police officers, paramedics, and FBI agents. The next few hours were a blur of medical examinations, police interviews, and legal procedures. I was taken to the hospital for evaluation, and while I was malnourished and suffering from the effects of long-term captivity, I was physically healthier than anyone expected. David, whatever his faults, had taken care of my basic needs during my imprisonment. The hardest part was learning what had happened in my absence. My parents had died in a car accident 18 months earlier, never knowing what had happened to me. My sister Sarah had moved to Portland and married her long-time boyfriend, but she'd never stopped believing that I was alive somewhere. Most of my friends had moved on with their lives, accepting that I was probably dead. And Michael. Michael was now happily married to Jennifer, and they had a 6-month-old baby daughter named Claire. They lived in the house that Michael and I had picked out together, the house where we'd planned to start our family. When the police told me about Michael's new life, I asked them not to contact him immediately. I needed time to process everything that had happened, and I needed to figure out how to handle the situation without destroying his happiness. But of course, the news of my rescue couldn't be kept secret for long. Within 24 hours, my story was all over the media. "Missing bride found alive after 3 years" was the headline on every news website and newspaper in the country. Michael saw the news on television while feeding baby Claire her morning bottle. According to later reports, he dropped the bottle and just stared at the screen in shock, unable to process what he was seeing. Jennifer found him sitting on the couch 20 minutes later, still holding their crying baby, still staring at the television with tears streaming down his face. The police arrested David at his apartment that same morning. He didn't resist arrest or try to run. According to the arresting officers, he seemed almost relieved that his secret was finally out. He confessed to everything immediately and provided details about the house where he'd held me captive that helped the FBI recover physical evidence of my imprisonment. The most shocking part, for everyone except me, was learning about David's role in the search for me over the past 3 years. He had been one of the most visible advocates for finding me, organizing search parties, maintaining social media pages dedicated to my case, and supporting Michael through his grief. He had played the part of the devoted brother-in-law so perfectly that no one had ever suspected him. The media coverage of David's arrest was extensive and ugly. Reporters dug into every aspect of his life, painting him as a monster who had manipulated his own family while holding an innocent woman prisoner. They interviewed people who had known David, looking for signs that everyone had missed. They analyzed his behavior during the search for me, looking for clues that should have revealed his guilt. But the truth was that David had been incredibly convincing in his deception. He had genuinely seemed to care about finding me and supporting Michael. His grief and worry had appeared completely authentic, because in his twisted mind, they were authentic. He had been worried about me, worried that I wasn't happy in my basement prison, worried that I wasn't learning to love him fast enough. And he had been grief-stricken about Michael's pain, because he truly loved his brother and hated seeing him suffer, even though he was the cause of that suffering. The psychological evaluation that was conducted during David's arrest revealed a man with severe mental illness who had constructed an elaborate fantasy about our relationship. David genuinely believed that I loved him, but had been prevented from expressing that love because of social pressure and Michael's manipulation. In his mind, he had rescued me from an unhappy marriage and given me the opportunity to discover my true feeling. The psychiatrist who evaluated David described him as having an extremely rare form of delusional disorder, combined with narcissistic personality traits and possible psychopathy. David was capable of functioning normally in most areas of his life, which was why he had been able to maintain his deception for so long. But when it came to me, his perception of reality was completely distorted. During his confession to police, David expressed genuine confusion about why I was pressing charges against him. He insisted that he had never hurt me, that he had taken care of me, that he had given me everything I needed to be happy. When confronted with the fact that I had been held against my will, he argued that I had simply been confused about what I really wanted, and that eventually I would have realized that being with him was the right choice. The legal proceedings were complex and emotionally draining. David was charged with kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, assault, and a dozen other felonies. His attorney tried to argue for an insanity defense, claiming that David's mental illness made him incapable of understanding that his actions were wrong. But the prosecution successfully argued that David's ability to plan and execute the kidnapping, maintain his deception for 3 years, and function normally in other areas of his life, proved that he knew exactly what he was doing. I had to testify at David's trial, which was one of the most difficult experiences of my life. Facing him in that courtroom, seeing him sit there in his suit looking like a normal person instead of the monster who had stolen 3 years of my life, was almost unbearable. But I forced myself to tell my story, to describe in detail what he had done to me, because I knew that other women might be at risk if David wasn't held accountable for his crime. David was ultimately sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge called his crimes among the most heinous acts of psychological torture she had ever encountered, and noted that David's complete lack of remorse made him a continuing danger to society. But the legal resolution of David's case was only the beginning of my long journey toward healing and rebuilding my life. The most complicated part was figuring out how to handle my relationship with Michael. I loved him. I had never stopped loving him during those 3 years in captivity, but he was now married to someone else, with a child, and a whole life that didn't include me. I had no right to disrupt his happiness, especially since his happiness had been built on the foundation of believing that I had abandoned him. I asked the police to arrange a private meeting between Michael and me, away from media attention and legal proceedings. We met at a small coffee shop in a town outside Seattle, with a police officer present to ensure my safety, but sitting far enough away to give us privacy. Seeing Michael again was both wonderful and heartbreaking. He looked older, more mature, but also more settled and content than I'd ever seen him. Being a husband and father suited him. But when he saw me, his face crumpled, and he started crying before we even spoke. "Emma," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. I'm so fucking sorry. I should have known. I should have protected you. I should have seen what David was doing. You couldn't have known," I told him, though part of me wanted to blame him for not recognizing his brother's dangerous obsession. "David fooled everyone. He fooled the police. He fooled your parents. He fooled me for years. You can't blame yourself for not seeing something that none of us saw. But I was supposed to protect you," Michael said. "You were going to be my wife. It was my job to keep you safe, and I failed. And then, when you disappeared, I gave up on you. I stopped believing that you were out there somewhere, needing help. You didn't give up on me," I said. "You looked for me for over a year. You hired private detectives. You never stopped hoping I would come home. But I got married," Michael said, the words coming out as barely a whisper. "I married someone else. I moved on with my life while you were being held prisoner by my own brother." We sat in silence. For a long time, both of us crying, both of us trying to process the impossible situation we found ourselves in. I wanted to tell Michael that I still loved him, that I forgave him for moving on, that I understood why he had needed to build a new life. But I also knew that saying those things would only make the situation more painful for both of us. Tell me about Jennifer, I said finally. Tell me about your daughter. Michael's face softened when he talked about his family. Jennifer was a nurse who specialized in pediatric care. She was kind, funny, and completely devoted to Michael and their daughter. Claire was 6 months old, just learning to sit up, and had Michael's eyes and Jennifer's smile. They lived in a house in the suburbs, with a big backyard where they planned to build a swing set when Claire got older. She sounds wonderful, I said. And I meant it. You sound happy. I am happy, Michael said, and then immediately looked guilty for admitting it. I mean, I was happy before I found out about you. Now I don't know what I am. You should be happy, I told him. You deserve to be happy. You have a beautiful family and a good life. What happened to me doesn't change that. How can you say that? Michael asked. How can you be so understanding about this? I married someone else while you were being tortured by my brother. Any normal person would hate me. I did hate you for a while, I admitted. When David would show me news coverage of your wedding, when he would tell me about how happy you were with Jennifer, I felt abandoned and betrayed. But I had 3 years to think about it, and I realized that you made the only choice you could make with the information you had. You thought I had left you. You had every right to move on. But what about now? Michael asked. What happens now that we know the truth? It was the question I'd been dreading, because I knew there was no good answer. I was still in love with Michael, but he was married to someone else. He clearly still had feelings for me, but he also loved his wife and daughter. There was no way for us to be together without destroying innocent people and betraying the commitments Michael had made. Now you go home to your family, I said. You hug your wife and your daughter, and you build the best life you can with them. You don't let David's crimes destroy any more lives than they already have. And what about you? Michael asked. What kind of life are you going to build? I don't know yet, I said honestly. I'm still figuring that out. But I know it's not going to be a life that destroys your happiness or hurts your family. We talked for another hour, sharing memories of our relationship and trying to find some kind of closure. Michael told me about his grief after my disappearance, about the therapy sessions and sleepless nights and months of wondering what he could have done differently. I told him about the hardest parts of my captivity, about watching him move on with his life, about the strange way I'd found strength in knowing that he was happy, even though I couldn't be part of that happiness. When we said goodbye, we both knew it was really goodbye. We hugged each other, and I could feel Michael's tears on my shoulder. But we both understood that this was the end of our love story. Not because we didn't love each other anymore, but because sometimes love means letting someone go. The media, attention surrounding my rescue and David's trial was intense and often intrusive. Reporters wanted to know every detail of my captivity, my feelings about Michael's remarriage, and my plans for the future. I did a few carefully controlled interviews, mainly to set the record straight about certain facts, and to advocate for other victims of kidnapping and abuse. But mostly, I tried to stay out of the public eye while I focused on healing and rebuilding my life. I spent several months in intensive therapy, working through the trauma of my kidnapping and the complex grief I felt about everything I'd lost. My therapist, Dr. Sarah Coleman, specialized in treating victims of long-term captivity, and she helped me understand that my experience was similar to what prisoners of war and cult survivors go through. The isolation, the psychological manipulation, and the complete loss of control over my environment had left me with symptoms similar to PTSD, but with additional complications related to the fact that my captor had genuinely believed he loved me. One of the hardest things to work through was my complicated feelings about David. After 3 years of daily interaction with him, I had developed a strange form of attachment that wasn't love, but wasn't pure hatred either. Dr. Coleman explained that this was a normal response to prolonged captivity, and that my ability to see David as a human being rather than a monster was actually a sign of psychological resilience, not weakness. But understanding my feelings didn't make them any less confusing or disturbing. I had nightmares about David, but I also had dreams. where he appeared as a sad, lonely figure who needed help. I was terrified of ever seeing him again, but I also felt a strange sense of responsibility for his well-being. Dr. Coleman assured me that these contradictory feelings would fade with time and continued therapy, but they made the early months of my recovery particularly difficult. Another major challenge was reconnecting with my surviving family and friends. My sister Sarah flew out from Portland as soon as she heard about my rescue, and seeing her again was one of the most emotionally intense experiences of my life. Sarah had never stopped believing that I was alive, and she had become something of an advocate for missing persons during my absence, working with other families who had lost loved ones. But our relationship had inevitably changed during my 3-year absence. Sarah was now married and had a 2-year-old son, who was born after my disappearance. She had built a life without me, and while she was overjoyed to have me back, we both had to work to rebuild our connection. I had missed her wedding, the birth of her child, and countless other important moments, and she had missed my traumatic experience and had no way to truly understand what I'd been through. My friends faced similar challenges. Some of them had moved away or gotten married during my absence. Others had simply moved on with their lives and found it difficult to reintegrate someone who felt like a ghost from their past. I didn't blame them for this. It was a natural response to an unnatural situation, but it added to my sense of displacement and isolation. The practical aspects of rebuilding my life were also overwhelming. I had no job, no home, and very little money. My teaching certification had expired during my absence, and the school where I'd worked had obviously had to replace me. My apartment had been cleaned out years ago, and most of my possessions had been donated or stored by my family. I essentially had to start over from scratch, like someone emerging from a coma after several years. The legal system provided some financial assistance through victim compensation programs, and eventually I would receive a settlement from a civil lawsuit against David's estate. But in the immediate aftermath of my rescue, I was dependent on charity and government assistance, which was humbling and difficult for someone who had always been self-sufficient. I decided to move to Portland to be closer to Sarah and to start fresh in a city where fewer people knew my story. I found a small apartment and began the process of rebuilding my career. I had to retake several certification exams and complete additional training to renew my teaching license, but I was determined to return to working with children. Teaching had been one of the things that defined me before my kidnapping, and I needed to reclaim that part of my identity. The process wasn't easy. I had anxiety attacks in crowded places, struggled with insomnia and nightmares, and found it difficult to trust new people. But I also discovered reserves of strength and resilience that I hadn't known I possessed. Surviving 3 years of captivity had taught me that I could endure almost anything, and that knowledge gave me confidence as I worked to rebuild my life. About a year after my rescue, I started dating again. It felt strange and scary to open myself up to romantic relationships after everything I'd been through. But Dr. Coleman encouraged me to take small steps toward normal social interaction. I met a man named Robert Chen through a support group for trauma survivors. Robert was a social worker who had experienced his own trauma as a refugee from Vietnam, and he understood the complex process of healing and rebuilding that I was going through. Our relationship developed slowly and carefully. Robert never pressured me to share details about my captivity that I wasn't ready to discuss, and he was patient with my anxiety and trust issues. We spent months just talking and getting to know each other before we ever even kissed, and it took almost a year before I felt comfortable enough to move in with him. Robert and I have now been together for almost 2 years, and while our relationship is different from what I had with Michael, quieter, more cautious, built on shared understanding of trauma rather than youthful passion, it's genuine and healing. Robert knows my whole story, including my continued love for Michael, and he accepts that part of my heart will always belong to someone else. In return, I accept that his experiences as a refugee have shaped him in ways that I can understand, but never fully share. We're planning to get married next year, on a small scale with just close family and friends. It won't be the fairy tale wedding I planned with Michael. I'm no longer the person who believes in fairy tales, but it will be real and meaningful in its own way. I still think about Michael often, especially on significant dates like what would have been our anniversary, or my birthday. I sometimes see news about him and his family. He's now a successful architect with his own firm, and he and Jennifer have had a second child, a son named Jay. They look happy in the photos I occasionally see, and I'm genuinely glad for their happiness, even though it sometimes makes me sad about what might have been. I've never contacted Michael since our meeting after my rescue, and I don't plan to. We both agreed that the kindest thing we could do for each other was to let go completely, and I believe that was the right decision. But I won't pretend that letting go has been easy, or that I don't sometimes wonder what our life together would have looked like if David hadn't destroyed it. David is serving his life sentence in a maximum security prison in Washington state. I've received several letters from him over the past few years, all of which have been screened by my attorney before I see them. The letters are disturbing and sad, filled with continued professions of love and attempts to justify his act. David apparently still believes that what he did was motivated by love, and that eventually I will understand and forgive him. I've never responded to any of his letters, and I've instructed my attorney to stop forwarding them to me. Whatever complicated feelings I may have about David as a result of my captivity, I know that maintaining any form of contact with him would be harmful to my healing process. He stole 3 years of my life, and I won't let him steal any more of my time or energy. One positive outcome of my experience has been my work with other survivors of kidnapping and abuse. I speak at conferences and support groups, sharing my story to help other victims understand that healing is possible even after the most traumatic experiences. I've also worked with law enforcement agencies to help them better understand the psychological dynamics of long-term captivity and the complex relationships that can develop between victims and their captors. This work has given me a sense of purpose and meaning that helps balance out the pain of my experience. If my suffering can help other people heal or help prevent similar crimes, then it wasn't completely pointless. It doesn't make what David did to me acceptable or forgivable, but it gives my survival some meaning beyond just personal healing. I've also become an advocate for better mental health resources and early intervention programs. David's crime didn't happen in a vacuum. There were warning signs of mental illness and obsessive behavior that were overlooked or minimized by his family and the mental health system. If David had received proper treatment for his psychological problems, my kidnapping might have been prevented. I don't say this to excuse David's behavior or to shift blame away from him. He made the choice to kidnap and imprison me, and he's responsible for that choice regardless of his mental health issues. But I believe that better understanding and treatment of severe mental illness could prevent some similar crimes in the future. As I finish telling this story, it's been almost 4 years since my rescue. I'm 35 years old now, living a life that's completely different from anything I could have imagined when I was 28 and planning my wedding to Michael. I'm not the same person I was before my kidnapping. That innocent, optimistic young woman is gone forever. But I'm not broken either. I'm stronger, more compassionate, and more aware of both the darkness and the resilience that exist in human nature. I still have difficult days. I still have nightmares sometimes. I still struggle with anxiety and trust issues. I still grieve for the life I lost and the person I used to be. But I also have good days now, genuinely happy and grateful for the life I've built from the wreckage of my old one. The most important thing I've learned is that survival isn't just about staying alive during a traumatic experience. It's about finding ways to build a meaningful life afterward, even when that life looks nothing like what you originally planned. It's about accepting that some losses can't be recovered, while still believing that new forms of happiness are possible. Survived David's attempt to destroy my life, but more importantly, I've learned to live again. I've found love again, though it's different from my first love. I've found purpose again, though it's different from my original career goals. I've found peace again, though it's a more complex and hard-won peace than the simple contentment I knew before. If there are other survivors reading this story, I want you to know that healing is possible. It doesn't mean forgetting what happened to you or pretending it doesn't matter. It doesn't mean your life will ever be exactly the same as it was before. But it does mean that you can build something beautiful from the pieces that remain, and that your survival has meaning beyond just enduring the worst moment. And if there are people reading this who love someone who has experienced trauma, I want you to know that your patience and understanding matter more than you realize. You can't fix what was broken, and you shouldn't try to rush the healing process, but your presence and support can make the difference between survival and truly living again. My wedding day was supposed to be the beginning of my happily ever after. Instead, it became the beginning of the worst chapter of my life. But it wasn't the end of my story. I'm still writing new chapters, and while they're different from what I originally planned, They're mine. And that's enough. David Thompson thought he could steal my life and force me to love him. He was wrong on both counts. My life belongs to me, and my love was never his to take. He may have stolen 3 years from me, but he didn't steal my future. And he certainly didn't steal my capacity to choose who I love and how I live. I'm Emma Richardson, and this is my story of survival, loss, healing, and the long journey back to life. It's not the story I thought I would tell, but it's the story I lived, and I'm no longer ashamed of how it ended. I'm proud of how I survived it, and I'm hopeful about what comes next. The fairy tale didn't come true, but real life turned out to be more meaningful than any fairy tale could have. And that's a lesson worth 3 years in a basement to learn.